Sarah Martinez had always believed that her hands were meant to heal, not to kill. Growing up in a small Texas town where her father worked as a paramedic and her mother as a nurse, she learned early that life was precious and worth fighting for. When she enlisted in the Army at 19, she chose the medical corps without hesitation. The oath she took was simple: do no harm, save lives, and never abandon a wounded soldier. During her first deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah carried this philosophy like armor. She treated wounded Marines, Army soldiers, and even injured civilians with the same dedication. Her medical bag was her weapon, her stethoscope, her sword. The other soldiers respected her for it, knowing that if they fell, Sarah would be there to patch them up and get them home. The forward operating base in Helmand Province was a dusty collection of concrete barriers, sandbags, and prefabricated buildings that somehow felt like home after 6 months. Sarah had set up her aid station in a reinforced bunker, complete with surgical equipment salvaged from various sources and medical supplies that she guarded more carefully than most soldiers guarded their ammunition. She had seen everything by now: shrapnel wounds from improvised explosive devices, gunshot wounds from sniper fire, burns from rocket attacks, and the invisible wounds that came from watching friends die. Each patient taught her something new about the human body's capacity to survive trauma, and each successful treatment reinforced her belief that medicine was her true calling. The base housed about 200 soldiers from various units, but the most interesting group was a small team of Navy SEALs who had arrived 3 weeks ago. They kept to themselves mostly, planning mysterious operations that regular soldiers weren't briefed on. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reed, was a legend even among Special Operations Forces. Tall, quiet, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had survived more combat than most people could imagine, he commanded respect without saying a word. Sarah first met Reed when one of his men came in with a deep laceration from a training accident. As she cleaned and stitched the wound, Reed watched her work with intense focus. He didn't make small talk like most officers, but she could feel him evaluating her technique, her efficiency, her composure under pressure. When she finished, he simply nodded and said, "Good work, Doc." It was the highest praise she had received from anyone in weeks. The SEALs operated differently than regular infantry. They moved at night, returned before dawn, and rarely discussed their missions with anyone outside their team. Sarah treated their minor injuries, cuts, bruises, the occasional sprained ankle, and noticed that they never complained, never showed fear, and always seemed to be planning their next move, even while receiving medical care. What she didn't know was that Reed had been watching her for weeks, not just during medical treatments, but during rocket attacks, mortar strikes, and the controlled chaos that defined life on a forward operating base. He had seen her run toward explosions when others took cover, seen her treat wounded insurgents with the same care she gave American soldiers, seen her work 18-hour shifts without complaint when casualties poured in from a major offensive. The intelligence reports that crossed Reed's desk painted a grim picture. Taliban forces were massing for a major assault on their base, using a network of caves and tunnels that intelligence had been tracking for months. The attack would come soon, probably within the week, and it would be unlike anything the base had experienced before. Traditional defensive strategies wouldn't be enough. Reed had requested additional medical personnel weeks ago, but headquarters had denied the request. Resources were stretched thin across the entire theater of operations, and their base was considered relatively secure. What headquarters didn't understand was that secure was a relative term in Afghanistan, and Reed's experience told him that the next attack would test every person on the base to their absolute limits. As he reviewed defensive plans with his team, Reed kept thinking about the base's medical capabilities. They had one overworked doctor, 2 medics including Sarah, and a small aid station that would be overwhelmed if they took heavy casualties. In a prolonged firefight, medical personnel would become as critical as ammunition, and Reed knew that conventional thinking about keeping medics away from combat wouldn't survive contact with reality. Sarah had no idea that her world was about to change forever. She spent her days treating routine injuries, conducting medical training for soldiers who might need to treat their own wounds, and maintaining her equipment. In quiet moments, she read medical journals that her parents mailed from home, always looking for new techniques that might help her save more lives. The other soldiers on the base had started calling her Angel, after she saved a young private who had stepped on an improvised explosive device. Working with limited blood supplies and no surgical specialist, she had managed to stop massive internal bleeding and stabilize him for evacuation. The private survived and returned to duty 3 months later, crediting Sarah with giving him a second chance at life. But Sarah never thought of herself as an angel. She was just a medic doing her job, following the training that had been drilled into her at Fort Sam Houston and refined through months of combat experience. She carried a sidearm like all soldiers, but she had never fired it in combat and hoped she never would. Her war was fought with bandages, antibiotics, and surgical instruments. The night everything changed started like any other. Sarah was restocking her medical supplies, checking expiration dates on medications, and updating her patient logs. The base was quiet, except for the usual sounds of generators, radio chatter, and guards walking their posts. She had just finished organizing her trauma kits when the first explosion shook the entire compound. The attack began with a coordinated mortar strike that knocked out power to half the base. As emergency lighting kicked in, Sarah grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the sounds of wounded soldiers calling for help. What she didn't know was that this was just the beginning, and that before the night was over, everything she believed about her role as a medic would be put to the ultimate test. Reed and his SEAL team were already moving, gathering intelligence and preparing for what his experience told him would be a sustained assault. As reports came in from perimeter guards, the scope of the attack became clear. This wasn't a random Taliban strike. It was a carefully planned operation designed to overrun the base and capture or kill everyone inside. The first waves of casualties arrived at Sarah's aid station within minutes. Shrapnel wounds, concussions, a soldier with a sucking chest wound who would die without immediate surgery. She worked with practiced efficiency, triaging patients, stabilizing the most critical cases, and calling for helicopter evacuation that might not be possible with enemy forces controlling the surrounding area. As she worked, Sarah could hear the battle intensifying outside. Small arms fire, grenades, the distinctive crack of sniper rifles. The sounds were getting closer, which meant the perimeter was being pushed back. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, Sarah realized that her aid station might not be the safe haven she had always considered it to be. Reed appeared at her aid station carrying a wounded soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied. "Doc, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying an urgency she had never heard before. "This isn't going to be like other attacks. They're coming for the whole base, and we're going to need every person who can fight." Sarah looked up from the patient she was treating, confusion and concern crossing her face. "Commander, I'm a medic. I don't fight. I save lives." Reed set down the wounded soldier and looked directly into her eyes. "Tonight, Doc, saving lives might mean taking some. Are you ready for that?" The question hung in the air between them as explosions continued to rock the base and the sounds of combat drew closer. Sarah had trained her entire adult life for moments like this, but not in the way Reed was suggesting. Everything she believed about her role, her purpose, and her identity was about to be challenged in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah stared at Commander Reed, her hands still working automatically to stop bleeding on the soldier in front of her. The sounds of battle were getting closer, and she could hear orders being shouted outside her aid station. For the first time in her military career, she felt truly afraid, not of being wounded or killed, but of being forced to make choices that went against everything she had been trained to believe. "I took an oath," she said quietly, not looking up from her patient. "First, do no harm. I'm here to save lives, not take them." Reed knelt beside her, helping to apply pressure to a wound. "Doc, look around. How many lives have you saved tonight?" Sarah mentally counted the soldiers she had treated since the attack began. 7, maybe 8 if that chest wound holds together until we can get him out of here. And how many more are going to die if this base falls? Reed's voice was calm, but intense. "There are 40 wounded soldiers in this compound right now who can't be moved. If the Taliban overruns us, they'll execute every one of them. Is your oath to let that happen?" The moral complexity of the situation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had never considered that saving lives might require taking lives, that her commitment to healing might be tested not by her willingness to treat enemy wounded, but by her willingness to prevent enemies from killing her patients. A massive explosion rocked the aid station, knocking supplies off shelves and causing the emergency lighting to flicker. Through the reinforced windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes getting closer to the compound's inner perimeter. The defensive line was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Reed stood up, checking his rifle and radio. "I'm not asking you to abandon your principles, Doc. I'm asking you to expand them. Sometimes the best way to save lives is to stop the people who are trying to take them." Before Sarah could respond, a young army sergeant stumbled into the aid station, blood streaming from a head wound. "Ma'am, Commander, they've broken through the north wall. Lieutenant says we've got maybe 20 minutes before they reach the command post." Sarah moved quickly to examine the sergeant's wound, cleaning blood from around his eyes to assess the damage. "Superficial scalp laceration," she announced. "You'll have a headache and some stitches, but you can still fight." She worked with quick, efficient movements, applying a field dressing that would hold until the immediate crisis passed. The sergeant looked relieved. "Thank you, ma'am. There are more wounded at the north position, but we can't get to them with all the sniper fire." Reed was studying a map of the base, marking enemy positions based on radio reports. "Doc, I need your honest assessment. How many critical patients do you have who can't be moved?" Sarah mentally reviewed her caseload. 3 definite can't-move cases, 2 more who could travel but might not survive it, plus anyone else who gets brought in during the next few hours. And if we have to evacuate the aid station, the critical cases will die. The words came out flat and matter-of-fact, the way she had been trained to deliver bad news to families. There's no way to transport them safely while under fire. Reed nodded grimly. "Then we hold this position, no matter what." Over the next hour, Sarah got a crash course in combat from an entirely different perspective. Reed showed her how the aid station could be turned into a defensive position, using medical equipment and supplies to create cover and firing positions. He explained fields of fire, crossing patterns, and how to use the base's layout to channel attackers into killing zones. "The key is to make them think this is just a medical facility," Reed explained, pointing out windows and doorways. "They'll expect minimal resistance, maybe 1 or 2 guards. They won't be ready for a coordinated defense." Sarah found herself thinking tactically for the first time in her military career. She knew the location of every building, every bunker, every possible route through the compound. She understood the medical needs of wounded soldiers better than anyone else on the base. Suddenly, she realized that her knowledge could be used for more than just treating casualties. "Commander," she said slowly, "the Taliban fighters, they'll be looking for prisoners, especially medical personnel. They know we're valuable for propaganda purposes." Reed looked at her sharply. "What are you thinking? What if we use that against them, make them think they can capture the aid station easily, then turn it into a trap?" For the first time since the attack began, Reed smiled. "Doc, you might have a future in special operations." The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. Sarah would continue treating wounded soldiers as normal, making the aid station look like a target of opportunity. Reed and 2 of his SEALs would position themselves in concealed positions around the facility. When Taliban fighters moved in to capture the medical personnel and wounded soldiers, they would find themselves in a carefully prepared ambush. As they prepared the trap, Sarah struggled with emotions she had never experienced before. She was still a medic, still committed to saving lives, but she was also now actively planning to kill people. The contradiction felt overwhelming until she looked at the wounded soldiers depending on her for survival. "This doesn't make me a killer," she told herself quietly. "This makes me a protector." Reed overheard her and paused in his preparation of firing positions. "Doc, you know what the difference is between us and them?" Sarah shook her head. "We're fighting to protect people who can't protect themselves. They're fighting to kill people who are trying to help others." That's not a small distinction. The first test of their plan came sooner than expected. A squad of Taliban fighters approached the aid station under cover of smoke, clearly intending to capture it intact. Sarah forced herself to act naturally, continuing to treat a wounded soldier while keeping track of enemy movements through peripheral vision. The attackers moved with confidence, apparently believing they had caught the medical facility undefended. They were through the outer perimeter and approaching the main entrance when Reed's carefully coordinated ambush triggered. The firefight was brief but intense, lasting less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Sarah found herself looking at bodies of enemy fighters, scattered around her aid station. She felt sick, but also strangely relieved. The wounded soldiers were safe, her medical supplies were intact, and she was still alive to continue treating casualties. "How do you feel?" Reed asked quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Like I just saved 8 lives by helping take 4 others." She paused, looking at her hands. "I didn't pull a trigger, but I was part of killing those men." "I'm not sure how I feel about that yet." "You'll figure it out," Reed said. "Most good soldiers do." The night was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated that the initial attack had been a probing action, designed to test the base's defenses and identify weak points. The main assault was still coming, and it would be larger and better coordinated than anything they had faced so far. Reed gathered his team and the senior medics for a planning session. "We've proven that the aid station can be defended, but the next wave is going to be different. They know we're here now, and they'll come prepared for resistance." Sarah found herself contributing tactical observations that surprised everyone, including herself. She had noticed patterns in enemy movement, identified likely approach routes, and developed ideas for using medical knowledge to enhance defensive preparations. "If they're planning to take prisoners," she said, "they'll try to disable rather than kill in the first assault. That means they'll use tactics designed to wound and suppress rather than eliminate. We can use that predictability against them." Reed studied her with new respect. "What do you have in mind?" "They'll expect us to hunker down and wait for rescue. What if we don't? What if we take the fight to them?" The suggestion was radical. Medical personnel were supposed to remain in defensive positions, treating casualties and waiting for combat troops to handle offensive operations. But Reed could see the logic in Sarah's thinking. "Explain." "I know where every wounded soldier is located throughout the base. I know which positions are undermanned because of casualties. I know which routes are clear for movement and which ones are blocked by debris." Sarah spread a map on the medical table. "If we coordinate with the remaining combat units, we could launch a counterattack that they won't expect." Reed smiled again. "Doc, you're thinking like a special operator." The transformation was happening faster than Sarah would have thought possible. 6 hours ago, she had been a dedicated medic focused solely on treating wounded soldiers. Now she was actively planning combat operations, thinking about enemy psychology, and considering how to use violence to accomplish humanitarian goals. As they finalized plans for the counterattack, Sarah realized that her identity hadn't changed. It had expanded. She was still a medic committed to saving lives, but now she understood that sometimes saving lives required more than medical training. Sometimes it required the willingness to fight for the people who couldn't fight for themselves. The counterattack would begin in 2 hours, just before dawn when Taliban fighters would be least expecting aggressive action from the besieged base. Sarah spent the time making final preparations, checking medical supplies one last time, and ensuring that wounded soldiers were positioned in the most secure areas of the aid station. Reed appeared at her side carrying something she had never expected to see in her hands, a Barrett M80 2.50 caliber sniper rifle. The massive weapon looked impossibly large and intimidating, its scope and bipod making it seem more like a piece of artillery than a rifle. "Ever fired one of these?" Reed asked, setting the rifle on the medical table next to her surgical instruments. Sarah stared at the weapon. "I qualified on the M16 in basic training. This is somewhat different." Reed smiled grimly. "Just a bit. But here's the thing, Doxy. This rifle can stop an enemy vehicle at over a mile. It can punch through concrete walls. And right now, it might be the key to saving everyone on this base." He began explaining the weapon's capabilities while Sarah listened with the same focused attention she gave medical lectures. The M82 fired rounds that were essentially small artillery shells, capable of destroying equipment and structures that regular small arms couldn't touch. In the right hands, it could change the entire tactical situation. "The problem is," Reed continued, "my sniper is down with a concussion from that first mortar attack. My other team members are good shots, but none of them have experience with this particular weapon system. It requires a very specific skill set, steady hands, precise control, the ability to calculate complex variables under extreme pressure." Sarah began to understand where the conversation was heading. "You think I have those skills? Doc, I've watched you perform surgery while mortars were falling. I've seen you thread sutures that would challenge a heart surgeon, while automatic weapons fire was coming through the windows. If anyone on this base can handle the precision requirements of this weapon, the parallel between surgery and sniping had never occurred to Sarah, but as Reed explained it, the similarities became clear. Both required steady hands, precise control, the ability to remain calm under pressure, and the confidence to make life-or-death decisions in split seconds. "Show me how it works," she said quietly. Reed spent the next hour teaching Sarah everything she needed to know about the massive rifle, how to adjust the scope for range and wind conditions, how to control her breathing for maximum accuracy, how to calculate bullet drop over long distances. Most importantly, how to make each shot count when lives depended on precision. The training session took place on the roof of the aid station, using sandbags to create a stable firing position. Sarah found that the weapon's weight actually helped her accuracy. Once properly positioned, it was rock-steady in ways that lighter rifles weren't. The scope revealed details of the surrounding terrain that she had never noticed before. The key targets, Reed explained, pointing out enemy positions through the scope, are the heavy machine gun nests they've established in those buildings. Regular small arms can't touch them at this range, but this rifle can put rounds right through their cover. Sarah studied the targets through the powerful scope. She could see enemy fighters moving in and out of positions, setting up equipment, preparing for their next assault. For the first time, she was looking at people she would personally have to kill, not as part of a general defensive action, but as specific individuals she would target and eliminate. "Remember," Reed said softly, "every one of those machine gun positions can kill dozens of our soldiers if we leave them alone. Taking them out isn't just about winning this fight, it's about making sure the wounded soldiers in your aid station live to see their families again." The moral framework helped, but Sarah still struggled with the personal nature of what she was preparing to do. Through the scope, enemy fighters looked like individuals, young men who probably had families, dreams, reasons for fighting that made sense to them. But they were also people who would kill everyone on the base if given the opportunity. As dawn approached, Sarah took her position on the roof, while Reed coordinated the ground assault from the command post. The plan was for her to eliminate the machine gun nests that were suppressing American positions, allowing the remaining combat units to advance and push the attackers back beyond the perimeter. The first target was a heavy machine gun position in a partially destroyed building about 800 meters away. Sarah could see 3 fighters moving around the weapon, setting up fields of fire that would cut down any American soldiers who tried to advance. Through the scope, she watched one of them adjust the gun's elevation, preparing to fire on positions she knew contained wounded soldiers who couldn't move. "Target acquired," she reported quietly into her radio headset. "Take the shot," Reed responded. Sarah controlled her breathing the way Reed had taught her, letting her heart rate settle into a steady rhythm. She placed the crosshairs on the machine gunner's center mass, calculated the slight wind drift, and gently squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round impacted with devastating effect. The machine gun and its operator simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cloud of dust and debris. The other fighters in the position scrambled for cover, but the immediate threat to American troops had been eliminated. "Good hit," Reed's voice crackled through the radio. "Moving to target 2. The second machine gun position was more challenging. Partially concealed behind concrete barriers and nearly 1,000 meters away, Sarah had to wait for the gunner to expose himself, tracking his movement through the scope until she had a clear shot. When she fired, the round punched through the concrete barrier and eliminated the target behind it. By the time she had destroyed the third machine gun nest, the tactical situation had changed completely. American forces were advancing on multiple fronts, no longer pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire. The Taliban attack was collapsing as fighters realized they had lost their key advantages. But the most important moment came when Sarah spotted a group of enemy fighters moving toward a building that housed 12 wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. The fighters were carrying explosives, clearly planning to destroy the building and everyone inside it. Through her scope, Sarah could see the faces of the fighters as they approached the building. One of them looked very young, maybe 18 or 19. Another appeared to be giving orders, pointing out specific targets within the structure. They moved with purpose and determination, committed to their mission. Sarah thought about the wounded soldiers inside the building. Corporal Johnson, who had been talking about his daughter's upcoming birthday when he was brought to her aid station. Sergeant Williams, who had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he got home. Private Chen, who was only 19 himself and still learning how to be a soldier. Multiple targets approaching the wounded, she reported. How many? Reed asked. 6. They've got explosives. Take them. Sarah fired 6 times in rapid succession, working the bolt action smoothly and tracking from target to target. Each shot eliminated one of the attackers before they could reach the building. When she was finished, the wounded soldiers were safe and the immediate threat had been neutralized. The counterattack continued for another hour, but Sarah's work with the rifle had broken the backbone of the enemy assault. Without their heavy weapons and key tactical positions, the Taliban fighters began withdrawing from the area around the base. By full daylight, the attack was over. Reed climbed to the roof to find Sarah sitting beside the massive rifle, staring out at the battlefield. How do you feel, Doc? Sarah considered the question carefully. Different. Still a medic, but different. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had saved so many lives over the past months. I killed people tonight. Specific people, not just contributing to a general defensive action. I looked at them through that scope, and I killed them. Any regrets? About saving the lives of American soldiers? No. Sarah stood up, picking up her medical bag. But I'll never be the same person I was yesterday. I understand now that sometimes saving lives requires taking lives, but that doesn't make it easy. Reed nodded. The best warriors I know struggle with that same contradiction. It's what keeps us human. As they climbed down from the roof, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching, medical evacuation flights that would finally be able to land safely and transport the most critical patients to advanced medical facilities. The base was secure, the wounded would survive, and her aid station could return to its primary mission of healing. But Sarah knew that she would never again see her role as purely medical. She had learned that healing sometimes required fighting, that saving lives sometimes required taking lives, and that the line between medic and warrior was thinner than she had ever imagined. The rifle would go back to the armory, but the knowledge of how to use it would stay with her forever. More importantly, the willingness to use it when necessary would remain part of who she was. She was still Doc Sarah, the medic who would never abandon a wounded soldier. But now she was also the medic who would fight to protect those soldiers when medicine alone wasn't enough. 3 months after the battle, Sarah sat in her aid station, cleaning the same surgical instruments she had used that night. But everything felt different now. The base had been reinforced. Additional medical personnel had finally arrived, and the Taliban had not attempted another major assault. Life had returned to what passed for normal in Afghanistan, but Sarah knew that normal would never be the same for her. The official reports credited the successful defense to superior tactics and coordinated defensive operations. Sarah's role with the .50 caliber rifle was mentioned only briefly, described in bureaucratic language as medical personnel providing fire support when required. But everyone on the base knew what had really happened, and Sarah found that her reputation had changed in ways she was still processing. Soldiers came to her for medical treatment, with a new kind of respect. They still called her Doc, but there was an understanding in their eyes that hadn't been there before. They knew she would not only treat their wounds, but would fight to protect them when necessary. The knowledge created a bond that went beyond the traditional relationship between medics and soldiers. Reed visited the aid station regularly, officially to check on his team members' medical needs, but really to talk with Sarah about the psychological aftermath of combat. He understood better than anyone the complexity of emotions she was experiencing, the way that necessary violence could save lives while still weighing on the conscience. The hardest part, Sarah told him during one of these conversations, isn't the guilt about killing people. It's the fear that I might be becoming someone who finds it too easy. Reed nodded thoughtfully. That fear is actually a good sign. It means you're still the same person with the same values. You're just someone who's learned that sometimes those values require different actions than you originally thought. Sarah had been keeping a journal throughout her deployment, originally focused on medical observations and treatment innovations. Since the battle, her entries had become more philosophical, exploring questions about the nature of healing, the ethics of violence in service of life, and the psychological transformation that came with crossing lines she had never expected to cross. One entry read, Saved 12 lives today with traditional medical treatment. Saved approximately 40 lives 3 months ago with a rifle. Both actions were motivated by the same commitment to preserving life, but society will judge them very differently. I'm beginning to think that society's categories are too simple for the moral complexity of war. The transformation wasn't just philosophical. Sarah found that her medical practice had become more aggressive, more confident, more willing to take risks when necessary. She had always been a skilled medic, but the experience of making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure had sharpened her clinical judgment in ways that surprised her. When a helicopter brought in casualties from a roadside bombing, Sarah worked with a level of focused intensity that impressed even experienced trauma surgeons. She made quick decisions about resource allocation, treatment priorities, and surgical procedures that might have paralyzed her with uncertainty before the battle. Having faced ultimate moral complexity, everyday medical decisions seemed more manageable. The psychological impact extended to her relationships with other medical personnel. The doctor who supervised the aid station had initially been skeptical of Sarah's expanded role, concerned that crossing the line into combat might compromise her medical effectiveness. But after observing her work for several weeks, he admitted that her experience had made her a more capable medic, not a less compassionate one. "You've learned something that most medical personnel never understand," he told her. "Sometimes the best medicine is preventing injuries from happening in the first place. Sometimes protecting your patients means more than just treating their wounds." Sarah's letters home to her parents had become more complex as well. She couldn't tell them about the specific details of combat operations, but she tried to help them understand how her understanding of medicine had evolved. She wrote about the interconnectedness of healing and protection, about the way that medical knowledge could be applied to tactical situations, about the moral clarity that came from accepting responsibility for other people's lives. Her mother, the nurse, seemed to understand intuitively. She wrote back about times when she had fought hospital administrators to get better care for patients, times when saving lives had required bureaucratic combat rather than physical combat, but the moral framework was similar. Her father, the paramedic, wrote about the protective instincts that developed in anyone whose job was saving lives, the way that dedication to healing naturally led to a willingness to fight for patients' well-being. The base received a visit from a general who wanted to understand the lessons learned from the successful defense. Sarah found herself briefing senior officers on the integration of medical and tactical knowledge, explaining how understanding casualty treatment could inform defensive planning, and how medical personnel could contribute to combat operations without abandoning their primary mission. "The key insight," she explained to the assembled officers, "is that healing and fighting aren't opposite activities when you're fighting to protect people who need healing. They become complementary aspects of the same mission." The general, a career infantry officer, listened with obvious interest. "Are you suggesting that we should arm all medical personnel?" "No, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm suggesting that we should recognize that medical personnel have unique knowledge and capabilities that can be valuable in combat situations, and that their commitment to saving lives might sometimes require them to take actions that go beyond traditional medical roles." Reed, who was sitting in on the briefing, smiled slightly. He had watched Sarah evolve from a dedicated but conventional medic into someone who understood the full spectrum of what it meant to protect and preserve life in a combat environment. After the general left, Reed and Sarah walked the perimeter of the base, looking out at the mountains where Taliban fighters still moved and planned. The war wasn't over, and both of them knew that similar challenges would arise again. "Any regrets about that night?" Reed asked. Sarah considered the question seriously, as she always did. "About the specific actions I took? No. Those people needed protection, and I was in a position to provide it. But I regret that the situation required those choices in the first place." "Would you do it again?" Without hesitation, Sarah replied immediately. "I understand now that my oath to do no harm doesn't mean avoiding violence in all circumstances. It means using whatever tools are necessary to protect the people who depend on me for their lives." As her deployment neared its end, Sarah faced questions about her future that she had never expected to confront. Reed had suggested that she consider cross-training with special operations units, arguing that her unique combination of medical knowledge and tactical understanding would be valuable in unconventional warfare situations. Other officers had recommended her for advanced medical training, seeing her enhanced confidence and decision-making abilities as indicators of leadership potential. Sarah found herself drawn to possibilities that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. She was still committed to medicine, still passionate about healing, but her understanding of what those commitments might require had expanded dramatically. She began researching programs that combined medical training with tactical education, looking for ways to develop both aspects of her evolving identity. The final entry in her deployment journal read, "I came to Afghanistan believing that medics don't fight, that our role is purely humanitarian, that healing and hurting are mutually exclusive. I'm leaving with the understanding that sometimes the most humanitarian thing you can do is fight for the people who can't fight for themselves. I'm still a medic. I'm still committed to saving lives. But I'm no longer limited by narrow definitions of what that commitment might require." When the helicopter arrived to take her back to the main base for the journey home, Sarah packed her medical equipment with the same care she had always used. But she also packed the knowledge that she could handle any situation that threatened her patients' lives, whether it required surgical skill, tactical planning, or the willingness to pick up a rifle when necessary. Reed was there to see her off, along with many of the soldiers she had treated during her deployment. "Take care of yourself, Doc," he said, shaking her hand. "And remember, the Army needs more medics like you. Medics who understand that saving lives is the mission and everything else is just tactics." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at the base where she had discovered new aspects of herself. She was returning home as a different person than the one who had deployed, not because she had abandoned her principles, but because she had learned to apply them in ways she had never imagined. She was still Doc Sarah, still committed to healing. But now she was also a protector, a guardian, someone who understood that the oath to do no harm sometimes required the courage to do harm to those who threatened innocent lives. The knowledge would stay with her forever, shaping her medical practice, her life choices, and her understanding of what it truly meant to dedicate oneself to preserving life in a dangerous world.